if we look at it through the lens of myth or fairy tale, which is like a good way sometimes for us to see these things, right? She had to live in a fantasy because reality would have been too scary and painful for her.
Oh, yeah.
And so, like, when I say fantasy, I don't mean it in a negative way, like, oh, you're like crazy or you're not living in reality, or you know what I mean? But we all live in a fantasy to some extent because we're always making up a story. And oftentimes, the world of the imagination is what keeps us safe in those developmental years when we need a buffering between the emotional pain of reality. And if we don't have um, a solid, secure attachment figure that we can anchor into, right? Because that's what you needed. When we talk about being like moved towards caretaking, so both of you are parents. So I know instinctively you probably feel an urge to be moved towards caretaking your child, right? You recognize, and this is where sometimes the responsibility feels too much, but you recognize that you're like maybe one step ahead of the needs of the child, right? It's like if you're attuned, meaning you're plugged into their system, then you're naturally instinctively mobilized to take care of their needs because they can't take care of it themselves. That caretaking drive is what Neufeld calls the alpha. Okay, so not so much the like leader of the pack kind of thing, but it's the drive to caretake. It's the instinct to recognize that there's a dependent. And so you're in the role of I'm responsible to take care of the dependent need, the needs of the dependent. So we don't just stop being dependent, right? We through our growth and development, we're always like in this dance of a little bit of independence and then we lean back into dependence. And this even happens in adults, in adult relationships where we ebb and flow between these two states of caretaking and resting in dependency role. So when we're developing, if we're bumping up against needing to be in the role of a dependent, so even as a teenager, we still very much we're at war with that, right? Like the teenage developmental era through the Neufeld lens, that the friction that we talk about within the teenage development is that they're wanting to step more into that role of I'm an independent individual, right? I no longer have to rest full time in the caretaking of my parents, right? I'm developing to then eventually move into a caretaking role, right? So this is why I have to push back against some of the caretaking actions of my, adult caretaker, my attachment figure. Does that make sense? And so when we take like two steps over here, so, Elena, for example, you're being swept away and wooed by this, young adult man who, for whatever reason, in his own ways, was in pursuit of you. It's natural that you might have been exploratory or curious or open to that, right? And kind of maybe leaning towards that as part of your, I'm going to be an independent woman, part of your initiation into teenage to adulthood, right? But then the caretakers, when there is healthy, secure attachment, would see that and see the imbalance in it and step in to caretake you again, right? That would be ideal. And we know that didn't happen for you. Actually, the opposite happened where there was almost encouragement of this, which is really confusing for that 14-year-old. So, of course, you went into fantasy, right, to make sense out of all of this because you might have been feeling something that you couldn't understand or name, mixed in with, you know, you're waking up to your sexuality at that age, right? You're waking up to your own drive for independence. You're already mature for your age. So, like, there's all this confusion with these mixed feelings, and there isn't the capacity at that time to sort that out and be discerning. That's where community of support, that's where healthy attachment figures come in. That's why we need initiations and ceremonies to help us developmentally, right? So that we can actually move through these natural developmental processes and be held throughout it versus, we're just kind of end up being thrown into these situations that often result in trauma. And they're trauma because the ordeal, which is what you went through, right? So an initiation is an ordeal. So if we look at it from a ceremonial perspective, there is a container that sets up a challenge. It sets up an ordeal. That's hard, right? And some of the initiations that we know of, we might look at and say that's brutal, that's barbaric, but the point being is that the container and the context is held within a community, within a understanding, even a ceremonial understanding of why we're doing this. And so even if it's super challenging and hard on us, we're met on the other side with that container that can then hold us in the return, if that makes any sense. So the conditions that are set for the ordeal are set in motion in such a way that the intention is that you will be held throughout it. So you feel held in that container. Of course, if we go back to the birth metaphor, right? When the birth container is held properly, then there's this opportunity to go towards the initiation or the ordeal of labor and delivery, even though it's going to blow us open, scare us, be too intense, be super painful, be like rattle us to the core, all these things. It's an initiation, but there's this container that we can trust in. And of course, as we've talked about before, we live in such a broken culture that we just don't have the containers that have the right conditions to hold the ordeal. So you were in an ordeal and it turned to trauma because there was no container holding it. So it was too much, right? Too soon, too fast, too scary, all these things. And so you had to survive it, which you did. And you've done it very well. Now you're in a place where you have enough maturity and capacity to now actually feel what needed to be felt and see it for what it is. So you're no longer seeing it through the lens of the fantasy. That's the thing is when we start to see reality for what for reality, and we're no longer filtering it through the lens of the story we've been telling ourselves or the fantasy we wanted to live in, right? Like the knight in shining armor fantasy that we've all been fed. That it's like shatters us because it's a psychic shattering. But that's the evolution. That's where the growth happens. But again, if we're not held in a container that has the right conditions to allow the shattering to take place so that you don't fracture, right? But that you can actually kind of come apart, but know that you're still held and there's still something that you can anchor into. It makes sense. You understand why this is happening. Hence, information is the precursor to transformation. If we have context, if we understand, oh my goodness, like my whole worldview is being shattered right now, but I can see what's happening here. I see this as part of my growth and evolution. I can see that I'm actually like growing in this and I'm metabolizing these feelings I couldn't metabolize, and I'm collecting my part and I'm looking at relationships through a different lens. Suddenly the shattering is not traumatic. So feeling the feelings is no longer traumatic. So anger makes a lot of sense because your boundaries were so violated on so many relational levels.